When they came, the first person went up to her and he was like, miss, ma'am. He felt her neck. And then that's when he told me she was dead.
We're trying to say that your DNA's at the scene.
It was evident to the detectives involved that Jonelle Melton was the victim of a brutal beating, and she was tortured.
Unlike most cases where women are targeted and unalived by people they know for one reason or the other, the story of Jonelle Melton is completely different. It was a case of being at the right place, but unfortunately, at the wrong time. The heinous attack she suffered before breathing her last came out of nowhere. There were no warning signs, and Jonelle's vicious attackers left no trail. This case would send investigators on a wild goose chase, containing twists and turns that would last almost a decade before leading them to Jonelle's attackers. What events led Jonelle to her tragic fate? And how were her attackers able to evade capture for so long? Let's find out in the story of Jonelle Melton, the 7th grade teacher who was beaten to death in her home.
She was a valued member of the community, and no one deserves for this to happen to them. But of all people, it's the fact that it happened to Jonelle. It's even worse.
On September 14th, 2009, 35-year-old Jonelle Melton didn't show up for work. Now, in most cases, someone not showing up to work is not enough to raise any alarms. But in Jonelle's case, it was very unusual. Jonelle loved her job and never missed a day of it.
Jonelle taught social studies, had a passion for history, and also knew how to teach it to students to get them interested in it. And her enthusiasm about history, it transferred to the students. They loved it.
And most importantly, she loved the students she got to teach. Getting to shape young Black lives was an honor for her. From the very beginning of her own education, Jonelle knew she wanted to be a teacher. As she went through elementary and high school, that desire never wavered, and her thirst for knowledge only got stronger. After high school, Jonelle went to college at Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland. But her thirst for knowledge didn't stop there. She moved back to New Jersey, where she had been born and raised, and her passion for education pushed her to get a master's degree. She gained admission into Monmouth University, a private university in West Long Branch, New Jersey, where she graduated with a master's degree in supervisory education. After completing her master's, Jonelle began her career as a teacher, and her commitment to teaching only waxed stronger as she advanced in her career. She started out teaching at the Village Charter School in Trenton, New Jersey, where she spent 3 years shaping the minds of the children she taught. The way Jonelle taught was very different from most teachers. She had an enthusiasm and commitment that was unmatched. After that, Jonelle moved on to the Granville Charter School, where she introduced her unique and creative style of teaching. Her approach to learning was very innovative and engaging, which was further proof of how much she loved to pass on the knowledge that she had. During her time at Granville Charter School, Jonelle became a long-term substitute for the Trenton Board of Education, but she soon left Granville after she secured a teaching position at Red Bank Middle School, where she would go on to be an excellent teacher who was loved by her students and colleagues alike. For 7 years, she ignited students' curiosity and critical thinking through her social studies classes. She was able to create a conducive learning environment where her students blossomed. This was why it was unusual that she didn't turn up to work on the morning of September 14th, especially because it was a special day and she had great plans for her class that day.
School had been in session for a couple weeks, and President Obama had did a speech about education. She was gonna bring her class to my class, and we were gonna play the speech inside the classroom.
When Jonelle didn't show up to school that morning, her husband, Michael Melton, who also taught at Red Bank, was a bit worried. At that point, he knew Jonelle like the back of his hand, and he knew she wouldn't miss school for any reason. She had been like that since he knew her.
I knew Jonelle in Trenton when we were young. Her elementary school was across the street from my house, and I used to talk little junk to her and, flirt with her a little bit.
Though their relationship started out as friendly and a little flirty, things got serious after Michael graduated from college.
Once I graduated from college, and I started working as a counselor for school-based youth service, and she was also a teacher, and I saw her. I was like, wow, she looking good. She was the one, and I felt like I should put a ring on her hand.
Michael and Jonelle's relationship moved very quickly. They both felt very strongly about each other, and before long, they were planning their wedding.
Me and Jonelle got married in Jamaica August 28th, 2003. I was excited and stuff, like I'm really married.
Jonelle was killing it at work, and she just married the love of her life. Everything seemed to be going great for her, but 3 years later, the cracks began to show.
She cared about me tremendously. It was just like, I had never met nobody that was so into me like that. Whatever I needed, she was right there.
Michael's upbringing did not prepare him for a life of love. He wasn't used to someone being 100% committed to him, and there for him the way Jonelle was, and it threw him off completely. And though their marriage was going well, Michael soon went into self-sabotage mode.
But the way I was raised, later on, it kind of made me feel uncomfortable because I wasn't used to that much affection. That's why I filed for divorce.
Michael filing for divorce broke Jonelle's heart. She still loved him and wasn't ready to let him go just yet, but she also couldn't deny him the divorce he wanted.
Most of the people probably thought that she wanted to divorce me, but she wouldn't have never left me. She told me that.
Because there was still a lot of love between them, Michael and Jonelle couldn't stay away from each other, and the fact that they taught in the same school and saw each other every day didn't help them let go.
So we still saw each other all the time, and we talked on the phone every day.
So on that day, as school wound down to a close and Jonelle still hadn't shown up, the school secretary turned to Michael. She told him she was worried about Jonelle and asked him to go check on her. Michael, who had also been worried, needed no other reason to go over to Jonelle's apartment.
I pull up at the house and I see the car in front of the house. So I feel kind of relieved because I know she at least home. So I'm thinking I'm just gonna bang on this door, yell out her name, tell her to get up and tell her to go to work.
Her car, parked at its usual spot, made Michael feel a whole lot better. He thought she probably overslept because she was so tired. To him, it was a simple matter of knocking on her door really loudly until she got up, except she wasn't answering. He was again filled with dread, so he tried the doorknob, and shockingly, it gave way. This made him even more terrified. It was unlike Jonelle to leave her front door unlocked. Little did he know what was waiting for him on the inside.
I tried the doorknob, and the door was open. And I went in, and I was still yelling out her name. And I made the quick left to go to the room, and then when I walked in the room, that's when I saw her on the floor.
When Michael saw Jonelle on the floor, surprisingly, he didn't think she was gone. He thought she had just fallen down, hit her head, and passed out.
When I found her, she had her nightgown on, and I saw a little bit of blood at the top of the nightgown, and her face looked like it had makeup on it. So I immediately thought that she fell when she was doing her makeup.
He immediately dialed 911.
That's when I picked up the phone and I called 911 and I told them to hurry up and come over.
911 confirmed what Michael was trying desperately not to believe. Jonelle was indeed gone.
When they came, the first person went up to her and he was like, miss, ma'am. He felt her neck. And then that's when he told me she was dead. Amidst
heavy tears, Michael called the school secretary who had sent him to Jonelle's apartment to inform her of what had happened.
I talked to the secretary and I'm like crying hysterically and stuff. Then I told him like, the guy says she's dead.
From what he could see after they turned Jonelle over, whoever had done it was a monster.
It was evident to the detectives involved that Jonelle Melton was the victim of a brutal beating, and she was tortured.
The investigators quickly cordoned off the crime scene and started their investigation. They theorized, due to the extent of Jonelle's injury, that more than one person had been involved in the brutal crime.
Because of how physical the crime scene was, how brutal it was, we believed it was a male more than one.
The investigators started working the scene, and a few things jumped out at them.
The kitchen dinette area had a window, which I noticed immediately as a point of forced entry.
They also found a foot impression under the window, which confirmed their suspicions that the attackers had entered through there.
Directly under that window, on one of the chairs, was a footwear impression where someone came through the window and stepped on that chair.
But there was one thing that was very curious.
Throughout the house, we noticed that there were no candles. We know that the victim was not a smoker. There were no cigarettes. There were no ashtrays.
Jonelle hadn't been a smoker and didn't own any candles. So what was a lighter doing in her home?
But at the base of that window, we located a pink-colored lighter. and the lighter itself seemed to be out of place.
September 14, 2009, at around 12:45 p.m., roughly 3 hours after Jonelle's body was found, her husband, Michael, was invited to the station for questioning. As with all cases like Jonelle's, the first person their suspicions turned to was the person who had found her husband, Michael Melton. They invited him in for questioning, and Michael was very cooperative. At some point during the investigation, Michael realized he was being treated like a suspect.
The detectives started out like they was trying to get information and ask me about our relationship. And then when I started answering the questions and telling them, then they started getting a little invasive.
While he went to the station with a clear mind, hoping to help them find who hurt Jonelle like that, he soon realized they were looking at him like they'd found Jonelle's attacker, him.
They was trying to come off of me like crazy and stuff. I just still was answering their questions because I knew I didn't do nothing.
Once they were able to establish the nature of his relationship with Jonelle, it was obvious that he couldn't be the one they were looking for. He had no motive. He and Jonelle had a good relationship, and they were supposed to meet that morning.
There was no reason for Michael to ever be involved in anything like this. He still had a wonderful relationship with Jonelle. Although they were ex-spouses, they didn't act like ex-spouses. They had a really nice personal and working relationship.
While the investigators cleared Michael of any suspicion, the media wasn't quick to let it go. They printed all sorts of stuff about Michael that made him look guilty.
Now, all of this time, I'm thinking that I'm being truthful and helping them, like telling them everything they needed to know. And then 2 days later, when the newspaper article came out, that's when I knew that something was wrong. It said she was found. It didn't say who found her. In the last paragraph, it said she was estranged from her husband. And when I saw the word estranged, I said, whoa.
Michael knew that everyone already thought he did it, and until they found who actually did it, suspicions would always fall on him.
Then it said their divorce was supposed to be final October 6th. And this was like September 16th, so now I'm like, oh my God. They trying to say I killed her.
While Michael was dealing with the aftermath of that cruel night, the investigators were neck-deep in the investigation, looking for clues. The people who attacked Jonelle could have left behind. They sent all the evidence they found at the crime scene to forensics, but unfortunately, they did not get back the answer they hoped to get. The boot print came back inconclusive, and they could not find any fingerprint on the latex gloves found at the scene. As for the lighter, it seemed to have exchanged hands many times, so it was hard to narrow down one single DNA from it.
In the case of the cigarette lighter, DNA-able evidence was recovered, but they were unable to identify who the major contributor was on that item.
So they sent it to New York, where the lab was bigger and they had better equipment.
As a result, I requested that we transport that evidence to the New York City Medical Examiner's office for additional DNA analysis.
But the answer they were looking for did not come quickly, so Jonelle's family braced for the third holiday season without her and with no clue as to who took her life. Luckily, after some time passed, the medical examiner's office in New York was able to narrow down the DNA on the lighter to one person.
They were able to identify the major contributor to the DNA as Gregory Jean-Baptiste.
The investigators wasted no time bringing Gregory in and grilling him on how his lighter came to be in Jonelle's house. Gregory denied knowing who Jonelle was, insisting he'd never stepped foot in her house.
We're trying to say that your DNA is obscene.
Without a confession from Gregory, and with no one willing to come forward to testify against him, the investigators had no choice but to let him go. After they let Gregory go, they were right back to zero. They had no other leads to work, no statements that could lead them to anyone, and no witnesses to even speak to, and the DNA evidence they banked on just failed them. Jonelle's case came to a grinding halt. Years passed by and her family cried out for justice. All they wanted was for someone to pay for the horrific things Jonelle had endured, but it was looking like they would never get justice. Jonelle's family weren't the only ones in agony over the lack of progress in Jonelle's case. Michael Melton was shattered. Not only had he lost the woman he loved, everyone thought he had done it. Wherever he went, people looked at him funny, and to make things worse, Red Bank Elementary School had tried to fire him. Michael was told he would not be able to teach or be near children as long as the case was still ongoing. Michael was not having it. He brought his lawyer to meet with the school board, and they ultimately came to an agreement that he would move to a desk job for the time being, at least until they find the culprit. Michael didn't like that. He loved teaching, and he was losing that too. He had enough. He desperately needed the investigators to find whoever did it, so he could at least clear his name. But that didn't look like it was going to happen anytime soon. So he decided he could not wait for the investigators to find the person. He would do it himself. There was one problem, though. Everyone knew Michael had been considered a suspect in the case at some point, so he knew people wouldn't want to speak to him about the case. But he had a friend who he knew could help him get into the streets and find information.
If something happened in Brighton Arms right there, the streets talk. I knew I couldn't go out there and get information from anybody because I'm not from there. So I knew he could. He called this guy over, and he told the guy, like, yo, this my man's. He just want to know what happened to his wife. It's driving him crazy.
Michael's guy on the streets went to work, and in less than 48 hours came back with some information. In less than 2 days, Michael managed to accomplish something it was taking the investigators almost a decade to accomplish.
We came back 2 days later, and the guy told me what happened.
The information Michael's guy came back with was not something anyone saw coming at all. It definitely was a twist in this tragic story.
So information had come off the street that individuals, gang members, were looking to rob a drug dealer named David Munch, an individual who lived directly next to Jonelle.
It turned out Jonelle wasn't even the target. She had just been unlucky enough to live next to him.
He said that the guy that lived next door to her had $15,000 in the freezer and some drugs in the house, and the girlfriend was running her mouth at a party.
Drunk at a party, David Munch's girlfriend proudly bragged about the cash in her boyfriend's freezer and narcotics all over his house. Unfortunately, people heard her, and the people that heard her also ran their mouths to other people. Those people turned out to be gang members. They made plans to break into David's house and steal both the cash and narcotics. Except on the night of September 14th, when they got to Brighton Arms apartment complex, they broke into the wrong apartment.
So they came to rob their house, and then they went to the wrong house. And then I guess they assumed that Jonelle was the girlfriend.
You see, the gang members who came to rob David Munch never met the girlfriend who was running her mouth off at the party. They were acting on secondhand information, so when they saw Jonelle home alone, they assumed David Munch was just away and she was his girlfriend. They were wrong.
The information coming into me was that these individuals, Ebenezer Byrd, Gregory Jean-Baptiste, and Jerry Spaulding, with a female, committed this horrific homicide.
Since Gregory didn't speak when he was invited for questioning, the investigators assumed the rest of them would not be easy to break either. They needed another way in. The investigators decided to adopt Michael's strategy. They themselves took to the streets in search of anyone who would talk, and while people wouldn't talk about the 3 men they were looking for information on, one person did mention Norika Scott, the girlfriend to one of the men. Norika was said to have some information that could help them nail the 3 men. They wasted no time inviting her in.
The video speaks for itself. The video shows her cooperation, how scared she is.
Norika proved to be easier to break than Gregory. She told the investigators what she knew of the tragic incident. Thankfully, David Munch's girlfriend wasn't the only one who couldn't keep a secret.
Norika said that when she was at a prison visit with Ebenezer Byrd, he had confessed to her that him, Gregory Jean-Baptiste, Jerry Spaulding were involved in the murder of Jonelle Melton.
There were said to be 4 people who drove to Brighton Arms that night. The 3 men and 1 gateway driver who happened to be a woman. While they knew the identity of the 4 men, they weren't so sure of the woman. The investigators tried to see if Norika could identify her, but the investigators didn't need to try that hard. Norika was ready to tell them everything.
So he says it's him and Jerry Spaulding, and he's with a girl. Do you know the girl if I showed you a picture?
Elizabeth Pinto.
A little digging into Elizabeth Pinto revealed that she was a former girlfriend of Ebenezer Byrd, and she turned out to be the glue that connected all the details of the case together.
Elizabeth Pinto was a former girlfriend of Ebenezer Byrd, and she turned out to be the key witness in this case.
They brought her in for questioning.
Hey, hold on. You all right?
At this point, the investigators had interviewed lots of people during their investigation, but this one was the most important of them all. Elizabeth Pinto could be the key to nailing the three men. The investigators knew there was no room for errors in this one.
So tell me about in September, early September, what happens?
Elizabeth was very scared. She knew what would happen to her if any of the men knew she was about to give them up to the authorities. But she had no choice. She had been carrying the information around for years, and she needed to tell someone. In a way, she was glad the authorities found her. Carrying the secret of what happened on that night had been a burden for her.
They all get dressed up in black. As they, done before, and they tell me to drop them off. I dropped them off at a location.
Let's slow it down a little bit.
Elizabeth held nothing back. Whatever she was asked, she answered.
Where did they tell you where they were going?
They just told me to drive. They told me where to go.
The information given to the investigators by Elizabeth broke the case wide open and led them to charge Gregory Jean-Baptiste, Jerry Spradling, and Ebenezer Byrd with first-degree felony murder, second-degree robbery conspiracy, and unlawful weapons charges. Despite irrefutable proof against them, all three men maintained they were innocent.
Well, I didn't do that. They lied, trust me.
And knew nothing about the murder of Jonelle Melton. At this point, Jonelle's case had gone on for 6 years. That was a long time for members of her family to wait for answers, so when they found out the three men had been charged, they were all very relieved and happy.
When this happened, it was like it reignited me, my hope. Like, wow, you mean she could get justice?
Members of the community who had also followed the case closely were happy the people who brutally attacked Jonelle were finally going to answer for what they'd done.
She was a valued member of the community, and no one deserves for this to happen to them. But of all people, it's the fact that it happened to Jonelle. It's even worse.
But the case was far from over. On January 17, 2019, 9 years after Jonelle Melton's life was taken from her, the trial of the men who took her life began. The prosecution had their case. They had DNA evidence and the testimonies of two women, one of whom drove the men to Jonelle's apartment. The defense, however, didn't have much, so they tried to give the jury another possible suspect, Michael Melton.
Throughout the trial, there's contentious motions going on between the defense and the state. They tried to make it look like Mike Melton did it. And that clearly didn't happen based on the evidence.
The only evidence they had against Michael was a tape found at the crime scene that had his DNA on it. The prosecution easily explained that away. First, Michael and Jonelle continued to have an intimate relationship with each other even after they separated, which could be proven by the texts they shared and some of Jonelle's neighbors who had seen him several times at her apartment. If he was constantly at her apartment, it was not hard to believe that his DNA would be on several items in her apartment, including the tape. But there was another reason why his DNA was on the tape, one Michael provided himself. He told the court that when he got into Jonelle's apartment, the morning he found her, the tape had gotten stuck to his shoe. He bent over to remove it, and that's how his DNA got on it. Once the defense was unable to successfully prove that Michael had done it, they resulted to create doubts about the investigators' process.
Police tested so many different items of evidence and went through so much forensic testing, and yet still the defense is, well, what about this? They didn't test this, or they didn't do that. They could have done this. What if? That type of thing.
The prosecution successfully countered every point the defense tried to raise. And other than the DNA on the lighter that put Gregory on the scene, the prosecution also had the phone records of all three men, and it put them within range of Jonelle's apartment on the night of the murder. With the prosecution's solid evidence and the defense unable to poke holes into their case, Ebenezer Byrd, Gregory Jean-Baptiste, and Jerry Spradling were all found guilty of first-degree murder, robbery, conspiracy, and weapons charges. One person who was present in court that day was visibly relieved.
Once I heard the first guilty, I just knew that it was gonna be guilty, 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 guilty. Then I was just like, yes. I remember doing that fist bump thing, like real happy, like yes, like it's over.
Michael Melton was not the only one incredibly relieved it was over.
When I heard it, I was at school. I couldn't contain myself. I ran into the principal's office who had a relationship with Jonelle and loved her. And I told her, and we just started hugging and crying. We just started hugging and crying.
Once the men were found guilty, it wasn't long before their sentencing. After deliberating for a short amount of time, the jury came back with the sentencing for the 3 men. Gregory Jean Baptiste, Ebenezer Byrd, and Jerry Spalding were all sentenced to life in prison. Even after their sentencing, all 3 men continued to maintain their innocence. Elizabeth Pinto got the lighter end of the sentencing. In exchange for her testimony against the men, she was allowed to plead guilty to conspiracy and was sentenced to probation. The case of Jonelle Melton, a case that ran for almost a decade, finally came to an end. Though Michael Melton had finally cleared his name, the case had left a mark on him, and he never went back to who he was before the night of September 14th.
On that day, 2009, 2 people died. Not only she died, but I died too because I wasn't the same person after that.
Neither, as a matter of fact, did many people who knew and loved Jonelle. Her absence left an ache that even time couldn't heal.
I miss her. I guess I'll always miss her. The pain and the anguish has diminished, but the missing her, that's still right there. It's right there.
Hey, thanks for watching. Our heart goes out to the family and friends of Jonelle Melton. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you know of other similar cases? Let me know in a comment, and before you go, make sure you like, subscribe, and hit that bell button. See you next time, and stay safe.